Hey everyone, so this is going to be a fairly big theory. It's not just that Killer might die. This is actually one of the biggest theories that I've been holding on to for a while now, and Killer's potential death is just one part of it. For those of you who have been following my channel for a long time now, especially those of you who followed my streams back during the initial quarantine days, and those of you who listen to my Patreon podcasts, you know that something I've been talking about for a while now is a major theory regarding Kid. And it's something that I promised I would reveal by the end of Act 3. But I decided there's just no point waiting on this any longer. Let me just share it, and if you call me crazy, then you can call me crazy. I think at the very least it is an interesting theory, and it starts with Killer's death. But before we get into that, make sure to subscribe for more One Piece content like this every week. So, as we all know, Hawkins recently declared that Killer has a 92% chance of death. And yes, it's very easy to write that off as Hawkins just being Hawkins, Oda building up the scariness of our current situation, implying that it's going to be a very difficult battle for the protagonist's side with a low chance of success. However, I do think it's interesting that we're hearing this specifically about Killer, that he has a high chance of death, because I actually had a theory from a long while back towards the beginning of Wano that Kaido may have actually killed Killer during the initial confrontation Kaido had with Kid's alliance. Obviously, I turned out to be wrong. Killer was actually alive. He had just been fed a smile fruit and, sent off the rails for a little bit. However, I still believe that a lot of my initial reasoning in that video may have been correct, that Killer was always set to die, and that I just got the timing a little wrong. I'm going to quickly speed through the crux of my argument from back then. It's largely based around what happened pre-time skip, particularly between Thriller Bark and Sabaody Archipelago. Thriller Bark was, of course, the arc where a lot of the initial setup and foreshadowing for the current 4 Yonko saga began. This was where Wano, Samurai, Kaido were first mentioned. We got a wedding storyline, we got the first tease of Big Mom, we got Oni imagery, etc. And most importantly, Thriller Bark focused on Moria, a pirate who had been broken after he lost his crew. In general, this idea of losing one's comrades was prominent throughout Thriller Bark, with Brook also suffering from that as well. This was also the arc that sidelined Luffy the most, and placed by far the most emphasis on the Straw Hat Pirates, his crew that he had assembled, and showcasing their value, putting the spotlight on them, focusing in on the greatness of the subordinates that Luffy had assembled. And most importantly, Moria gave us a warning that Luffy is going to lose them all. He's going to lose his crew in the New World. That is supposedly the nightmare that is waiting for Luffy. That is of course what Moria himself experienced. Then the very next arc is Sabaody Archipelago, which has Luffy experiencing a taste of what Moria warned him about, with Luffy nearly losing all of his crewmates, and the storyline ends with Luffy realizing that he is too weak for the New World, and he and his crew need to get stronger to never lose them. And most importantly, the pirate in the New World that broke Moria and killed his crew was Kaido. The original video goes more in depth into these ideas, but the gist of it is that I do think that the storyline of Wano, and by extension the storyline of Kaido, was always foreshadowed since Thriller Bark to once again threaten the loss of Luffy's crew, and to test Luffy's growth from when he failed as a captain to protect his crew back in Sabaody Archipelago. And there have been a lot of small things in Wano that suggest to me that this very well could be the case. For instance, the story of Odin and how his defining, iconic moment was saving the lives of his subordinates, and how Wano has now begun to focus on Conqueror's Haki, the disposition of a king or leader. I like to think that these ideas do go somewhere, and Oda picks up from what he seemed to be setting up from Thriller Bark and Sabaody, that back then Luffy was told and shown that he would be too weak to protect his crew in the New World, that the entire New World was leading up to this arc, where we are up against the same opponent, the very same opponent that broke Moria and killed his crew, that this is also the arc that is focusing on Luffy's growth as a leader, that this arc has showcased what a great leader is to his subordinates. I think there is something there, and I hope Oda ties it all together, with Luffy having to protect his crew from Kaido in some way before this is all said and done. Again, Kaido was introduced to us after all as the crew killer, and from everything we've seen, Kaido's goal is always to break individuals and make them work for him. Kaido is of course seeing that there is nothing he can do to Luffy that will break his spirit, but I do wonder if the ideas that seem to have been planted since Thriller Bark and Sabaody can come into play. I do wonder if Kaido will at some point realize that there is a way to break Luffy, which would be through going after his crew. We saw what losing Ace did to Luffy, that alone broke him, and the only thing that brought Luffy back was that he still had his crew. At this point in time, they are everything to Luffy, and that is actually Kaido's best bet for attempting to break him. So how does that lead me back to Killer? Well, I do think that the best way for Oda to demonstrate the threat of Kaido potentially killing off Luffy's crew would be for Luffy to witness Kaido killing off a member of another Supernova's crew. Yes, we know Moria said Kaido killed his crew, but I'm saying in the real, current story, actually visually seeing that happen, something like that happen, would be much more powerful and defining for Kaido's character, and establish the reality of that threat of going after someone's crew. And I think Killer makes the most sense, as the other characters, the other subordinates on other Supernova crews are simply way too minor for something like that to have any effect. Whereas Killer is actually a prominent character, and has actually been fighting side by side with Luffy for some time now. Now, I know you might be thinking that, look, Morge, that's a huge leap, that even if maybe Kaido ends up threatening up Luffy's crew, even if that ends up being a thing, that doesn't mean that Kaido actually has to kill a character in the current story before that to establish that threat. And that is entirely true. But there are a few interesting things about Killer that make me believe that Oda has always written him to be ultimately expendable. Again, speedrunning some of my old arguments, out of all the Supernovas, Killer is clearly the one Oda put the least amount of time and thought into when he was designing him. Every other Supernova was given a Devil Fruit except for Killer. Honestly, the Supernovas have by far some of the most creative Devil Fruits in the entire series, but Oda skipped out on Killer. And more importantly, Oda spent zero time even thinking up of a creative name for Killer, whereas a lot of other Supernova names are references to major historical figures. Oda outright says that he just thought up of the name Killer because he was being lazy. And that's really weird, because Oda claims that the only supernova he knew was going to be important was Kid. Oda claims that the other supernovas he wasn't even sure if they were going to be important or were going to last. If that was the case, then that suggests that things should be the other way around, and that Kid and his first mate, as the only guaranteed long-term players in the story, in theory, those would logically be the supernova Oda would put the most thought into. So then why is it that everything from Killer's visual design, abilities, and most importantly his name suggests that this is clearly the supernova with the least thought put into him if he was going to be a long-lasting character? That makes a little more sense to me if Oda always planned on him being expendable from the start. And now we're sitting here with Hawkins telling Killer that he has a 92% chance of death. And I kind of believe it. Yes, obviously it's a Hawkins prediction. Take it with a huge grain of salt. This is the guy that implied that X-Drake has a 1% chance of survival, when we can all be pretty sure that X-Drake is going to be just fine at the end of this. But you have to understand where I'm coming from, which is that I do believe that thematically it does make a lot of sense for the idea of protecting one's crew to come into play in this arc. I do think that the threat would be significantly more vivid if we actually did see a major character subordinate die, and I do think that Killer from the start has just been designed as a very killable character, and Act 3 has still not ended, which means in theory there is still some great moment of tragedy yet to come, and if it's going to be a character death, I would definitely toss Killer right in there with the Scabbards at this point as a major possibility. Now, the major pushback that I'm sure there is for this idea is that in theory, it completely screws over Kid. And this is where I want to talk about the full theory. We all have very high expectations for Kid. This is meant to be Luffy's biggest, rival out of the Supernovas. Many readers hope that he somehow achieves, say, Yonko status or something like that over the course of the story. I think a lot of people were already questioning how much of a rival Kid could even be to Luffy when most of his crew seemed pretty insignificant compared to the Straw Hat Pirates. However, Killer turned out to be a pleasant surprise for many of us in that he actually did hold up well alongside everyone else on the rooftop, and was even capable of damaging Kaido. So honestly, it looked like, yeah, maybe there's something there. Even if we haven't seen much of the rest of the Kid Pirates, at the very least the first mate is actually pretty strong, so the potential of a rivalry between the Straw Hats and the Kid Pirates was still alive. And now what, so I'm saying that Kid loses Killer? Wouldn't that basically take away the one star player the Kid Pirates have going for them? Not so fast. So first of all, stepping back, for Kid himself, for his character, I think the potential for his character behind seeing Killer die is tremendous. I think for Kid to get to, that next level where fans really want him to be at, some sort of major trigger for growth would be great. This would be the equivalent to Luffy losing Ace, for example, only for Kid, it can actually manifest in a much more immediately productive way, in that Luffy was too weak at the time to do anything about Ace's loss. He had to train for a long time, whereas Kid is already a strong enough character that this could be the trigger for his, for his haki to bloom in some new way, as we know, that gets him closer to that top level. And just in general, I think it's a great path for a Kid as a character to actually finally get to explore his character and what he's gone through to get here, what he just lost, what his goals are, etc. But more importantly, The question up in the air is what's the deal with Kid's crew? What happens to Kid's crew? If Kid loses Killer, then Kid's crew pretty much just sucks. So let me preface all this by saying that this was a theory I didn't put out for a long time, because I wanted to wait and see if Killer actually died before feeling confident in this next part of the theory. However, after that little Hawkins prediction last chapter, I just decided whatever, there's no harm in at least talking about this for fun. I'm going to put it out there and you take it as you will. I fully acknowledge that this next part of the theory is significantly more speculative, but oh well. At the very least, bare minimum, I think you'll find it's an interesting idea to talk about. So I think that Killer was always going to be expendable, and that Kid's crew in general look like some generic Joes, because I think this was always going to be a sort of prototype crew for Kid. I'm not saying everyone here is dying, I do think Killer will die, but I'm just saying that I think the Kid Pirates as we were introduced to them at Sabaody were not the final version of the Kid Pirates we were going to get. I think Kid's actual crew may be composed of several of these guys. So, for fun, pretend for a second that you're writing a story, you have this rival plan for Luffy, and you're going to introduce him at the Sabaody Archipelago arc before the Straw Hats go to the New World. But then your editors tell you the arc is too boring and you need some more characters. So, Oda says that he just made up a bunch of the supernovas out of the blue. What if the process was more so that Oda had a blueprint for some cool members of the Kid Pirates, say a Hawkins, Apu, maybe an Urauch, I'm just spitballing here, but what if a lot of these characters that were turned into individual captains and supernovas were initially Kid Pirates? If Kid really was always going to be a major player, then just like the Blackbeard Pirates, what if Oda had clear concepts and designs and abilities for Kid's main crew members, and when his editors told him to spice things up, then the route Oda went was to actually split up Kid's crew and just make them individual rival pirate captains, so that there are actually now several rival pirate crews that have come together at Sabaody Archipelago, which is a far more exciting scenario. And finally, Kid gets a placeholder squad to start with at least one notable member, with the plan always being that eventually these other supernova would unite under Kid's banner down the line. Now, before you go saying that this is the most random, baseless theory of all time, consider two things. First, Oda's interview. From the interview, it sounds like Oda already had a plan for Sabaody and only added supernovas later when the editors told him to spice things up. However, if we look at Sabaody without the supernovas then, what is the arc initially about? It's an arc that was always leading up to Luffy losing his crew. It's a series of events that lead to Luffy experiencing this nightmare that Moria warned him about. The arc concludes with Luffy losing his crew. So, Oda had this little storyline of Sabaody, of Luffy losing his crew planned out, and then he's told to make things more interesting. If Oda's already in a place where he's writing about the main character losing the crew, then I think a possibly natural, fairly natural idea that would come out of that would be, what if the rival I'm introducing this arc will also lose his crew down the line? That makes two birds, one stone, because that makes for a dramatic storyline for this rival down the line, and it means that the crew that Oda currently has designed for Kid can actually be split up to make for additional rivals that will make Sabaody arc more interesting. And that's a nice hypothetical, but on top of that, the big point is the ability that Oda chose to give Kid. Magnetism. It's an ability that I think many readers find boring or generic, but very often in One Piece what matters more is what the ability says about a character. I've done this many times before in different videos, but let me rattle off some examples. Luffy is rubber because he always bounces back. Doflamingo uses strings because he is a manipulative puppet master. Moria uses shadows because he is a shadow of his former self. Ace has fire because he's a fiery spirit. Big Mom creates life because she's literally a big mom. You can go down the list for Devil Fruit user after Devil Fruit user, and almost every single ability says something about their character, and that's doubly true for the particularly important characters. So what about the fact that Luffy's biggest rival's ability is magnetism? That's what really had me thinking for a while, and I think what we may be set to discover about Kid's character is that he has the ability to draw people together. I know that may sound really weird considering that Kid, as we've seen him so far, has not exactly been a charming, charismatic individual, and if anything, most of this arc he's been spelling out to us how much he doesn't like other people or wants to work with other people. But I think that may be the point. If this is Kid at the start of the arc, then I think we could see a very different Kid by the end of this arc, because I don't believe Oda gives out these abilities, especially to main characters. I don't believe Oda gives out these Devil Fruit abilities without making sure it actually matches the character themselves in some significant way. So if Kid's ability is magnetism, if this arc is about focusing on Conqueror's Haki users coming into their own, if this arc started with Kid wanting nothing to do with anyone else, then I do wonder if his character arc has to do with becoming someone who can actually draw people together. I wonder if that's something that can actually make him feel like a more fitting rival to Luffy, if this unique trait of Luffy's to turn people around him into allies is going to be something that Kid grows into as well. And so again, I understand this is speculation on speculation, I'm just proposing an interesting idea for you all to talk about. But think about it, if Oda had this character, a rival for Luffy on paper, and was going to write an arc of him turning into someone who can draw individuals together as defined by his ability of magnetism, and if during the Sabaody Archipelago arc, Oda was pushed by an editor to add more to the arc, then just think about this, Oda may have taken Kid's crew and split them up, made them individual captains. This sets up for a future storyline where Kid can come into his own as a leader and actually bring individual captains under his banner, very similar to what Luffy has done with the Grand Fleet, and on top of this, by giving Kid a placeholder crew to start with, Oda can tie into these ideas planted in Sabaody and Thriller Bark of potentially losing one's crew by having that nightmare become a reality for Kid in Wano. That sets the stakes for Luffy, and that Luffy has to be able to protect his crew in Wano, while simultaneously setting up a plotline for Kid to overcome the loss of his subordinate, and not only grow stronger, but actually grow stronger as a character, by being able to gain the respect and bring together these other captains as his ability of magnetism suggests. So that's the wildly speculative theory. I think it works a lot better if the raid fails and there's time for certain developments to occur, but I think it's a still feasible possibility, just a big stretch, even if this is the final battle. So let me quickly address a few big objections I'm sure you all might have. First of all, does it even make sense? Why would Apu join forces with Kid? Why would Hawkins? What about Drake? What about the other supernovas that aren't even here? So, to be clear, I don't think all the supernovas are joining under Kid. Law is obviously his own man. Bonnie has some unique role to play in the story that may not be tied to any of the other supernovas. I'm not saying, everyone joins. But if we look at characters like Apu and Hawkins, they only betrayed Kid and switched sides because they were playing the odds. Neither believed that they could fight back against the Yonko. Apu is already regretting his decision. I think it's very likely Hawkins will regret his decision as well by the end of this. How does this lead them back to Kid? That's highly dependent on what Oda has Kid show over the course of this battle. It would have to be something that brings them together, but honestly, stuff like that, changing allegiances, is pretty quickly doable, as Oda has been showing. Oda has been having characters shift allegiances and change their minds on a whim multiple times this battle throughout Onigashima, so that's nothing new. For other supernovas to actually permanently join Kid, it would have to be something pretty major that he does that makes them have faith in him. But if I were to throw out an example scenario, let's say Kid impresses over the course of the battle, gains their respect. By the end of the Wano, let's say the Straw Hats are being called a new Yonko crew. I think it's entirely possible that several supernova, in the wake of all that, form an alliance to at least be able to compete with the Straw Hats as well as other Yonko crews, with Kid as sort of just the de facto leader of this new makeshift alliance, somewhat similar to the Rocks scenario. So I'm not saying that everyone's just in love with Kid by the end of the arc, just that he may have earned the respect of other pirates to the point that if a makeshift alliance were to be formed again, this time he may actually be the leader of said alliance. I could see Hawkins and Apu having changed and come around to Kid by the end of this. I think Oda can do pretty much anything with Urauge, so joining up with Kid shouldn't be out of the picture. And I could even see someone like Beige joining forces for a common goal, such as taking down other Yonko crews, if he were to come into contact with Kid's group. To me, if you imagine Kid as being a Yonko by the end of Wano, like a lot of people want to happen, I think this is the path that kind of is most interesting or makes the most sense. Kid at the head of a makeshift alliance comprised of other supernova who are working together to compete with the remaining Yonko. To me, this finally would give Kid a good counterpart to what the Straw Hat Pirates have going on, because Luffy's crew is honestly filled with powerhouses and extremely valuable members. The Kid Pirates as we know them, to me, first glance, they just don't cut it. But guys like Hawkins, Apu, maybe Urauge, maybe Beige, suddenly that's a very competitive crew against anyone. You could even speculate some fun matchups that come out of that. Not to mention, I personally think it's a somewhat elegant solution for some of these just hanging supernova storylines, rather than just, as far as we know, there's so many supernovas running around and they all have these individual storylines that are just running seemingly indefinitely. So having several of these plotlines kind of come together to form one main rival crew for the Straw Hats, the creation of a new Yonko crew essentially, that seems very fitting to me, rather than just, for example, just having, let's say, Hawkins' story ultimately amount to nothing more than being, a minor villain in the Wano arc at the end of the day. I've also seen some people say they want most of the supernova to come together under Luffy, but to me that personally feels somewhat boring and kind of diminishes the significance of the supernova if they just end up as, generic Grand Fleet Division members alongside the likes of Orlumbus and Leo, I do think coming together to form a new, powerhouse in the pirating world that actually rivals the Straw Hat crew, really the Straw Hat Empire that's beginning to form, I think that would be really, really interesting. So I think that's an interesting idea. If you enjoyed, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon for extended thoughts on this and all future topics.